Ta-da! Welcome everyone to the Municipal Bill. So glad to have you back. We have a very interesting guest today. As you know, inviting people who are coming from all walks of life. Some of them are academics, just like Dr. Jeeva, who is joining us today. And Dr. Jeeva is from the Thabo Mbeki Public and International Affairs Institute. I'm sure all of you guys, you know that institute. It's under UNISA. Dr. Jeeva, welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm glad to.
I know you are a researcher and an expert who has taken keen interest in local government over the years. Yeah. Nasipa, I thought we should have this kind of discussion with Dr. Jeeva because it's very important for us if we are going to be talking about local government, particularly, at this point where we are reflecting of 25 years of local government, and we now know that there is this review of the white paper that has been initiated by the Department of Cooperative Governance. Dr. Jeeva, it's very, very important for us, to take a step back and go back into contemporary history a little bit, just to see and understand exactly what informed the kind of local government system that we have today. Because previously, we had Trevor Fowler, who came through, just to talk about the negotiation processes that led to the local government system that we have, and also just, reflecting at the way in which these metropolitan areas, were demarcated, restructured, districts and local municipalities, and also how the Constitution started to promulgate on Chapter 7 on the objectives of local government, etc. But one thing that I really like us to bring into this conversation is actually understanding the other influential factors that contributed towards the decentralization system that we have in South Africa, particularly post-1994. Because we know that after 1994, South Africa had a debt crisis. Municipalities, they were owing a lot of money in their piggy bank because obviously the boycotts that were happening back in the days. But the structuring of local government has also been largely influenced by other international organizations such as the IMF, the UN, the World Bank. And how did we come to make these assumptions that we'll have a semi-autonomous local government system that will be efficient in terms of service delivery, that would be financially self-sustainable and viable, that would also promote democratic participation, and also have a very effective political leadership that would be elected. So I thought, let's bring this discussion. We can't talk about the white paper without really understanding these influential factors that have led us to what we have today.
Thanks. For me, Tina, why I'm interested in this discussion, and welcome from my side, is because right now there's a process to review the white paper on local government, and the president, he made that pronouncement not in this previous State of the Nation address, but it was last year, 2024. Obviously there's a need for that, but maybe just to get deeper insight of when the previous one was done in 1998. Published in 1998. What was the context? And maybe some pointers. We've done this thing called local government. What should we be looking at? And timely discussion indeed.
So, Dr. Jeeva, let's just go back into time.
You take it back.
Before we even talk about decentralization, what is this concept called decentralization and how it came about?
South Africa, you need to really go right back to time to understand why is it that our cities look the way they are, why do we operate the way we are, and why do we interact with each other the way they are, right? Or the way that we are. So I'm going to take you right back to, colonial times, right? Where we had the white colonials that came in, and automatically they decided that they're going to have their own separate areas, and the Africans are going to have their own lands, right? And what happened was, with time, apartheid took over, right? And they decided that, they're going to further implement this colonial system, and the urban areas are going to be for white people, and all non-whites are then going to be banished, or can I say Africans? Let's just say Africans are going to be banished to the homelands, right? But God had a different plan, put it that way. What happened was, during that time, they discovered gold and coal and, natural resources, and they needed cheap labor. to come into the cities to extract those resources. So they made concessions to their own laws, and they said, okay, we're going to allow migrant laborers to come into the city areas, but they're going to be located on the outside or the peripheral of the urban areas, right? But they needed to travel in and out every day, right? And there was no restrictions really on where you could stay. So what happened was many of those that could afford stayed closer to the urban areas, just to decrease cost and to become more efficient with transport. And when apartheid came in, they realized that no, this is not what they're up for, because now there's a lot more migrants coming into the urban areas than what they would like. So they wanted a white supremacy within the urban areas. So what they did was they then created the Group Areas Act, and they then banished the non-whites into a very classical model that we see nowadays. It's the apartheid model, where you have the whites and then the high income whites in the north, and then the middle income towards the south, and then further south you would then have the Indian area, the colored area with buffer zones, of course, the colored area within a buffer zone, and then further up you could be buffered with a highway or a railway would be the African townships, right? But what they did was they then also implemented self-governance, self-administration, right? So what that meant was that each area needed to manage their own region, but they would still be taxed to pay the urban area, all right? So in essence, what that created was a very unequal, spatial, fragmented city, right? And unfortunately, the black area was further restricted, where they were not taken as permanent residents to the city. So they were not provided with infrastructure, they were not provided with housing, they were not provided with basic services. And that was on the condition that, you're here for the time being, and then you need to go back to the homelands where you stay. And if you're not going to do it, and then they would create permits, right? Just to make sure that the people that were living in the area were the people that were supposed to live in that area, right? However, with anything that's restricted, you would find rebellion, right? And because the homeland areas were not allowed to develop and, to economically stimulate themselves, because they were restricted in terms of businesses, many of those that lived in poverty within the homelands had no other option for survival purposes, I would say, to move to urban areas in search for jobs, right? Or some sort of hope for their family. So that created this mass movement out of the rural areas, right? And this then challenged the apartheid system. Right, that was close to about 1986. I'm talking about the period of 1986 to 1990, right? And that was a time when the apartheid government also decided, okay, you know what, this is now unmanageable, right? And they then came to the negotiation table to say, okay, you know what, clearly our systems are not working. We need to bring about change, right? And one of the first things they've done during that time was to uplift influx control, right? And that was, could I say, the start of many of the problems that we find today. Because, remember, apartheid had very controlled populations, right? And they had a very structured top-down system. They would tell you what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, how it was allowed, when it would be allowed. And then now suddenly, you're uplifting controls, right? Mostly due to rebellion. And that created an influx of people coming into these areas, right? But these urban areas didn't have a economic base to support the inhabitants that were moving in. Neither did they have control of how many people were coming in. In the African areas, which is the cheaper area of the city, most migrants, started infiltrating first, because remember, many of them moved from poverty. They didn't have an income, so they moved into the townships, and that creates sprawling informal settlements, right? And now you can see it over the years. I mean, that's like your camp of where you would come in with the hope of getting a better job, right? Now, with all of these problems, we also had a political change that came about and said, okay, you know what, we need to transform the country, we need to integrate the country, and we need to create the Rainbow Nation, right? One of the ways that they would create spatial integration or a new look to the country to show that this Rainbow Nation is what they wanted it to be would be spatial reform, right? And one of the tools they used was the city, right? So the interim constitution came in and they said, okay, how are we then now going to integrate our cities, right? Integration was also a buzzword at that stage, introduced by the United Nations, right? And the context that the United Nations had introduced this integrated city development was because the European cities or the South American cities at that stage were sprawling, right? So they had a high economic growth rate. People were moving into the cities in search for jobs, and they were sprawling. Now, in the South African case, we had restrictions that were lifted, but we had a sprawl of poverty. If I can create context, right? But now you wanted to create an integrated city. And the question came out, how are you going to then integrate the city? So the interim constitution came in and said, okay, let's categorize our settlements into metropolitan, urban, and rural, right? But the critique behind that was, if you separate your urban areas from your rural areas, you're going to further segregate racial profiles.
Sure.
Right? And that was something that you were trying to overcome in the first place. So what they came up with within 1994, 1995 was that, okay, this urban and rural segregation is as viable as it might be, because remember, the rural areas were developed at a different level to the urban area, right? And if you had separated them, you would be able to, pinpoint exactly what needed to be developed in those regions and then bring them up and then integrate them. But we couldn't do that because that would be the normal model that you would follow. We couldn't do that because of our political history. So they said, okay, let's take the integrated model from the United Nations, right? And that model was not based on demographics, but based on administrations. So, and I previously mentioned that administrations were previously, I think, 1,262 were based on racial profiles. Right? So what they did was they took the Indian administration, the colored administration, the African administration, the white administration, and they said, let's combine them, right, to create an urban area. Right, that was one level, and then the legislation also further said, if there was regions outside this that were integrated economically, like you had movement of people, that region should also be further amalgamated, right? And that's how we created our municipalities, local municipalities as such.
Can I just stop you there, because you keep talking about integration as a concept that the UN said we must aspire towards. What do we mean by integration? Because I also understand that if we say you are integrating, it means that there's something and then you're being brought into it. So what were they being integrated into? For us to understand whether were we integrating different systems and spaces into a functioning core, or was it not functional?
This is a very valid question, right? So when you speak about the apartheid city, I'm sorry, I should have elaborated on that further. The apartheid system only allowed for the urban area to have an economic base. Right? No other suburb or periphery or administration was allowed to have an economic base. Right? So that implied that inhabitants from the urban area, from the Indian area, the African area, the colored area, were forced then to travel to the urban area to provide a service, get goods and amenities, and then travel back to the rural area. So when
selling their labor,
including selling the labor, right? And then you had an uneven tax base in that case, because now the urban area was developing, whereas these areas were lagging behind. So when they spoke about integration, it meant that all those people that were contributing to the tax base should form a municipal area, because you rightfully had, you had the right to those services. So when you integrate them, the tax base becomes equal. It's supposed to become equal, right?
So it was an integration into the urban system, and not vice versa. It wasn't to say we are integrating the urban and the rural.
No, and that is my biggest gripe with this at this moment in time, right? Was they never acknowledged the fact that the Indian area, the colored area, and the African area could be classified as rural. They always looked at it as a periphery or a suburb of the system, right? But in actual terms, it was just it was a rural area because there's a buffer zone of 20 kilometers. Right, and it was minimal population density, minimal economic base, but you fail to acknowledge that. Until today, I have this gripe, and many of my papers speak about it, is that why do you not acknowledge that rural development also implies the suburbs on the outside?
So in my case, and I keep referring to where I come from on this podcast, I come from Enanda, and I saw that transition as a child. One could classify, except for the formal townships that were established by the Urban Foundation towards the end of the 80s, the large part of Inanda, which was incorporated into eThekwini municipality, is rural. And it was treated as urban as part of that integration. And I suspect that it came with its own challenges, which maybe later on you can share with us.
Yes. But that is a challenge that we still face with regards to the white paper. You were saying, we're trying to figure this out. This is one of the things we need to address, to say that rural is not just homelands. Rural is also the townships outside, that the Indian, because these are poverty traps till to date. I mean, Tina and I were speaking about it. Yesterday I was looking at property values, right? Within an urban area, you would find property values up to 2.2, 2.3 in the white suburbs and the gated communities, whereas the group areas, the property value is sitting at 60,000. How do you get rid of your asset and move up? So these are still challenges that you find in the integrated model. Bring it back to the integrated model.
But it's quite fascinating how you really analyzing the spatial integration within the deracialization in the way in which local government was structured. And most probably this is why, in some of our episodes that we have to cover, Nosipho, we have to specifically dig deeper into the demarcation of municipalities, because this becomes very critical. And of course, because we're talking about the subject of decentralization, we understand that the geographic integration contributes a lot towards building a local government system, whether it's local or district or metropolitan. But the other aspect that I would like to bring in, into this conversation, particularly when we have to link it to the deracialization, is the thinking around integrating smaller towns with rural municipalities with the assumption of financial ability to raise their own revenues. Now, this is the point that I really want to link up with these IMF policies that were introduced, because remember, South Africa was running away from structural adjustment policies. So we needed to find a way in which we could be able to...
I'm sitting with two doctors.
So structural adjustment policies are macroeconomic driven policies of a country, where a country needs to move beyond relying on the public sector in order to deliver services, but also start to introduce issues related to raising revenue, raising your own budget through tax collections, and also commissioning of services as well, to make the state more efficient, to shift away from this notion of having a state that is driven by public administration, but now a state that is going to be driven by integrating corporatist values in the way in which they run the state, so that the state can be able to raise its own revenues.
Okay, so self-sufficient. Okay. Self-sufficiency.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that really grappled South Africa during that transition, and we'll still deal with these issues a bit later. But my worry, Dr. Jeeva, is that with this assumption of saying, let's now integrate your smaller towns with rural municipalities, in order to try and, introduce equitable distribution of resources and ability to raise revenue. But then it doesn't really address the fact that there are some municipalities that are absolutely 100% rural. Now, this brings us to that debate and argument, if whether the way in which we understood our decentralization system and forming local government, did we really think about the context and the implications that it will have in South Africa?
Okay, so tonight,
This is a loaded question, but it's a very relevant question, right? And when you go back to it, the problem with that comes with the wall-to-wall system that we promised initially, right? Where we said no municipality will be left or no area will be left out, right? And on that basis, when you look at the South African model, 1994, right? You would find that there was a lot of homeland regions, in regions that were, we would say, not habitable, if right, but they needed to be integrated with, right? And the inhabitable areas were also those areas that had sparsely populated, sparse density, right? So when you created a municipality, you were forced then to create it with some sort of economic base. And because the homelands were not allowed to have an economic base, that often meant, adding it to a growth pole region, right? And the growth pole regions were created around the 1980s where, they decided that they need labor, but they don't want the labor to come into the urban area. So what they did was they had a boundary, and the industry was situated on the outside of the urban area, right? And these people would be situated on the homeland region, and they were allowed to travel up and down, but not pass, not live there. So now when I want to create an integrated model, I had no other option but to create to create a model around the inhabitable area with the growth pole region and bring it in, because the model, the section 24 says, I'll actually read it for you. It's very interesting, and that brings us back to that concept of subjective classification and categorization, right? So Section 24 of the Municipal Demarcation Act actually states that you should be able. This is the criteria that you need to demarcate a municipal boundary, right? And it says there should be an independence of people, communities, and economies.
And independence.
Independence, right?
Communities,
economies, and people.
Okay.
Right. And this brings us, on a smaller scale, if you want to understand it, it would be your cities. Right? Because remember, people were dependent on the urban area to get an income. But now you had these huge homelands.
Absolutely.
And no economic base, because they were not allowed. They were not allowed to integrate. So now you had to, and that's a similar case to Mangaung. We spoke about it earlier, where you have these huge homelands, but no economic base, and then you have a urban area, if I could put it that way, about 50 to 60 kilometers, right? With no development in between. But now I couldn't keep a rural area alone, because that's not what the Constitution called for. It called for an integration of urban and rural areas. So they were, in order to abide by the constitutional mandate, they needed to integrate, right? And that brings me back to, I did some studies around it currently, just to give you an idea of what that means right now, right? Is that if you look at, let's look at KwaZulu-Natal. Yeah, let's look at KwaZulu-Natal, right? So there's a municipality called Lagibale, local municipality, Inkosi Lagabale municipality.
Inkosi Langalibale municipality, yes.
That area.
I've been there. I went to do a training.
Where about is it?
In KwaZulu-Natal.
Where in KZN?
And closer to the regions of, what do you call this, Dundee and...
Oh, there, Newcastle, Dundee. Yeah, okay.
That area, right? So that municipality on its own is 4,000 square kilometers, 3,400 square kilometers, right? But the density of that region is only 63 people per square kilometer. Right?
I suppose it could be worse in the Northern Cape, right?
I'll take you there to Northern Cape. And then you look at, when you talk about financial viability, right? The average household income for that municipality is sitting at 2,100. Right? So that just tells you, is there an economic base for you to have a region that big?
So that independence of you were talking about earlier on.
It's there because it dilutes it. Remember, there could be many people that are unemployed within the region. right? And secondly, it's a very sparsely populated
Yeah.
region. So when you're looking at dysfunctionality and you're looking at financial viability, you have to look at these stats. Absolutely. Right? And it's beyond my understanding as to how do you create a municipality that has a financial basis of only 2,100.
Absolutely. And it actually links up to some of the data that we are finding to be coming up quite prominently if you look at the district composition of local municipalities. For example, the Alfred Nzo municipality has been categorized as one of the worst impoverished municipality. And if you really zoom deeper, you only find that Matatiele is the main economic hub for that district municipality. Ntabankulu is a completely rural area. You also find Winnie-Madikizela Mandela, which has a small little town that used to service your villagers around that homeland. It's a very small town that has struggled to grow, although it has a large population. But again, it does not have that substantive economy that can drive that economic development in such a municipality, which obviously has implications in the way in which a municipality collects its revenue.
But there's two things, Tina, that I want to bring to this discussion. So one can, and I would like for you to touch on this, because I'm sure when whoever designed the system and with the structural adjustments that you were talking about, the IMF and the UN, then they said, okay, you need to think about this, meaning that your financial model needs to cover the parities. And I suspect that's why you've got your different grants from National Treasury trying to close that gap. I would like to hear your opinions on how does that continue or create a problem for government itself, because clearly these areas have got no economic base and they'll forever be drawing from the national fiscus. And if the economy does not perform, what happens to people in Ntabankulu? I was in Ntabankulu last year for the first time, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Maybe just talking a bit to that, how then the finances then get implicated, not only for the local municipality, but the national finances.
Especially this equitable share, because it's one of the things that we discuss quite importantly in this podcast, is understanding where the sources of revenue and financing come from. But now there's this element of equitable share. Of course, government would argue that there is an equitable share.
Yeah.
But is it sufficient enough to contribute towards the infrastructure upgrades and development of, for example, Dr. Jeeva, building an in-road that will lead from one village to the other in Ntabankulu?
I'm going to take you right back to, going back to the model that I was speaking about, the unequal development of the city, right? Now, if you go back and you really understand what it means when they say they integrated the area, right? The white area or the urban area or the city center as we currently know it was the well-developed area, right? Then you had the suburbs that were not developed, right? Many with dirt roads, many with lack of infrastructure, lack of economic base, lack of schools, lack of clinics. And now you integrated this area to say, okay, we've got an integrated model, right? However, what you fail to see is the inequality on the ground. Now, when Treasury provides funding, whether it's grant funding, whether it's infrastructure funding, it goes to one municipality and it's one pot. Right? Now, municipality often sits with the question of, okay, I have this pot of money, but I have deteriorating infrastructure within my city, and I have an area outside that lacks infrastructure, right? If I do not maintain my infrastructure within the CBD, my economic base is going to fail. And that brings into question my financial viability, right? However, if I do not provide services for those on the outside and the new migrants, I constantly have protests and they burn down the infrastructure that is currently standing. And this, unfortunately, is the place that municipality finds itself, between a rock and a hard place, to say, no matter how much of money I am trying to, or I get from government, I have too large an area that is too unequally developed for me to get any benefit out of it. Because it's getting diluted, right? And you'll see it, like you'll see some RDP houses being built just to pacify those that need RDP houses. But then I have infrastructure or sewage systems blowing up in my CBD that requires my services, right? But my fiscus only allows me an annual budget. And I once I set my targets, my KPIs, it's very difficult to shift my KPI and my budgets as well. And that's also another level of integration that we currently have a very big problem with, because when you're setting your KPIs in the beginning of the year, you are unaware of what issues you're going to have at the bottom. And one of the city managers were telling me that, we set up budgets. We think, this area needs infrastructure. Only to realize that we over budgeted for this area and we under budgeted for that area, but we're not allowed to shift the budget in between. Right? And that brings the concept of, financial budgeting. And we spoke about this earlier. So I don't know how we're going to overcome this, but, spatial integration is one thing. But social integration, financial integration, environmental integration, it's all different concepts that need to be unpacked before you create the green white paper.
What you are saying, and please, I hope the woke people are not going to misquote me here.
All right.
The reason why I labored on the integration bit is that there was an assumption that which you are integrating to is aspirational, that everything else should then emulate or look like. And we did not say, but maybe it doesn't need to look exactly like that. And I'm not by any ways saying that we did not need to provide services to people of color. We needed that. But did it need to be at the exact same level given the function of those areas? And I say this now because we're talking now about just energy transition, just transition in general. And when we propose the institution that I'm with, which is South African Cities Network, to say, you don't need, in some instances, to put a concrete pipe for stormwater drainage. You can just have some of the natural, channel the water. If I was to take that and say, let's implement that in Soshanguve or Seshego, they're going to say, because we are in a black township, why don't you do it in suburbia? So I'm still arguing that maybe the integration, it was the aspirational, and it's going to be difficult based on the race relations that we come from to then shift people from saying on functionality, not on anything else.
Yes, you're touching on aspects of social justice, and spatial justice, and yes, you will be taken to the cleaners for the UN.
Yes. and worse. Now, we were just talking about the issue of sustainable development goals and the universalicity of or should I say universalization of sustainable development goals that do not take into account.
When we say universal as well, remember, equal and equitable are different. And I think sometimes part of this, in this discussion, part of it is that we have misused these terms, the equal and equitable. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. Maybe you do have, or maybe I've just lost my marbles on this.
No.
You can't shy away from your socio-economic justice topic.
No, you can't. No, we've definitely missed the target with terms of equality and inequality, right? But we are also working with a large population that has been underprivileged. Yes. Right? And they feel deprived. Yep. And you need, we were talking about building confidence to aspire to greatness, right? And one of the things you need to do is when you say equality and equality and equitability are different, but you also can't miss the human aspect to it. And and the effect that has on sparking greater good. So you can say provide basic services just to get by, but then you're creating that cycle, of I've always got worse things than my counterparts, right? And I had done a study, was it last year or the year before, with one of my students, and it was a basic study, and I said, let's go and look at the quality of parks within a city, right? And I was astonished by the findings, because we looked at a park in the white area, right? This is Potchefstroom. and it was botanical park, right? With all of these exotic plant species and benches and, a typical white person park. And I say this to be politically correct, but that is what it is, right? They had amenities, they had trash cans, they had light poles, they had gates, they had bathrooms that were functioning, right? And you would think this is the standard that you're going by. And then we went and we looked at one in the CBD, right? This is where you have an influx of migrants coming in and taking up the houses. The infrastructure was deteriorated, toilets were not working. It was actually being used not for recreational purposes, but for sorting out trash, right? Yes, a different land usage and a different usage, but does it provide the services that it was supposed to provide to those people living there? And then we went into the African area, right? And there was a park that was demarcated, and there was plans for it, amazing plans, all right? Money was allocated for it. And you go and visit there, and it's the same feel that you would find in the apartheid, just a bare piece of land with not even a goal post, right? And, I sat and I questioned, and I said, do these children from the township actually know that there's a life beyond this? Although you live in the same city, because many of them don't have cars, many of them, have never left the township per se. They go to the CBD because that's where the taxi takes you, and you go back. But you are not aware of the other services that are provided, right? And if you do not start providing those type of services within the area, how are you going to spark that change?
But how much of that, using that evidence of Poch, how much of it goes back to what you were talking about, to say some areas during this process of integration were already far advanced than others? And I'll use so it's a similar case with universities. I can say if a park in my neighborhood, there are neighborhood drives to say that contribute money, we doing the fence, we're cutting the grass, the municipality is not doing it as often as it would do it. The same doesn't happen in some neighborhoods because, first of all, it's not even an issue of money. The time that you want them to spend working on the park, they could use it trying to get some money for themselves. So how much of that contributes to these things as well?
Yeah, no, it's a very complex issue. It's and unfortunately, you should not take the aspect of corruption out of this whole equality and equitability concept. Because remember, if they always speak about those that are deprived. Always, when you show them resources, they're more likely to fill their own stomachs before they can fill other people's stomachs, right? And that also creates a drain in fiscus and the financial viability, because if you really go and scrutinize the budget reports, right? Who pays 2,000 rand for a broom? Right? But it's somewhere along the line, it gets through the system.
It does.
And then you question, where did the money go to?
Exactly.
And the same thing with the spark that I'm talking about in Poch. I mean, the municipality was aware of it. They had discussions around it. They got a town planner on board or architect on board to say, let's go and develop this area. They've got plans for it, but nobody went and went to see whether it was implemented, right? And the people within that region were so used to being subdued that they don't know that they can actually raise their voices to say that right now, what you promised us is not here. Can someone please go and look for some justice for us?
But Doc, once again here, instead of me protesting for a park, right? Remember I was talking about what the aspiration of that integration. Instead of me protesting for a park, I'll protest for jobs, for an example. I'll protest for a contract. I would protest for roads, those different needs.
And that's the Maslow hierarchy of Maslow of needs. Right?
Now these days that is very much outdated, considering the complexities that we have.
But that's why.
But that's why we have community participation that was implemented in the South African context, to say, go back down to the community and find out exactly what you require, what you need, right? Exactly. And a typical example, I come back to this Zaakirah park, right, was when we did a survey of that area. They were using it to graze the sheep and the goats, and the boys were using it for soccer.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And in this case, they had planned a park with prize and and volleyball, and those are things that they didn't need, right? And then it leads you to question. Unfortunately, you only had 8,000 word count there, but it leads you to question as to what was the community participation behind creating those models, right? And what type of community participation do we have within these integrated cities? Because me sitting as I would call myself privileged in many aspects. I do not understand the struggles that someone that is underprivileged would experience, right? And, this week I had an aha moment where I had, I've got a helper at home, right? And she's not well. And she messaged me to say, how can I go to Clicks, right? And for me, it was like how can someone not know where Clicks is? And I said, it's about 4 kilometers down the road. And then I said, you'll get your medication from Clicks for 20 rand, not so expensive. And as soon as I typed it, I stopped and I thought. And I said, but 20 rand is an eighth of her salary for the day. Right? And then I'm asking her to take a taxi to go to Clicks, and that would be another 40 rand. So where it would cost me 20 rand, because I'm going to go do my other shopping anyways, it's costing her 60 rand. Absolutely. Right? So where's the equality 25 years later? Because these services are supposed to be provided within a range that it can be accessible to them. But these companies are not going into the areas that require them. Right? So that's also another level of integration that we can bring in to this whole debate of how are we creating municipalities. It's beyond. It's more than just the boundary. It's a functioning of the city and the experiences of the people, to make them feel included and, appreciated.
Absolutely. And, even, community participation, it actually feeds into the point that I was trying to drive, saying that what kind of model did we think we were going to have, and what kind of outcomes did we think we were going to get? Because if we now have to tap into political decentralization, there was this assumption that when it comes to decision making, local government would have the powers and autonomy to facilitate the participation of communities. Because like what you said, previously, racially, Black South Africans were excluded. Indians were excluded. Your colored communities were excluded, not to even mention your villages in rural areas. They were operating in a different governance model. But this was to integrate the participation beyond elections, but also continuously being involved in decision making, being involved in the way in which resources are being spent, like our budgeting processes. So this political decentralization model,
the wards and the councillors,
seems to be, not working the way.
Yeah. So the issue that they're having with the appointment of wards and councillors, right, is they shift every few years. Firstly, right. So before you can find your feet, there's another election coming up, right? So there's no stability. The other aspect that we've picked up with regards to wards and councillors is they are community elected, right? And that goes according to popularism. And many times the most popular person is not the best person for the job. And many of them are unaware of the systems of government or the roads that need to be taken to alleviate or to escalate an issue. All right? And you're there because you've got a profile, you're getting possibly a stipend. And that's where your job ends, according to them, right? I got elected, fine and well, but what are you doing for the community, right? And I had an issue where I went into one of the townships, and well, it was a bit of a sketchy experience because those people would refuse to talk, and then I eventually got them, just to talk a bit to me, and I asked them, who's your ward councillor, right? This is a very interesting case because it was a community that was established on a buffer zone, right, between the Indian area and the former white area, right? And it's an African area with migrants from all different areas around, right? And the ward councillor was a white man, right? And I said, okay, I'm not being racially biased in this case. It's fine. You all elected him, right? And I asked, okay, how often does he come into the municipality? No, he doesn't come. I'm like, okay, why does he not come? Because there's apparently a mafia that works within this community that has threatened his life. Right? So as much as he wants to come in, there's tenderpreneurs that would rather have him not come in to see what's going on. Right? So when you speak about the decentralized political system, you know, what we fail to see is the cultural differences between people. And, you know, we overlooked it. Until today, you know, one of the questions I have is, we all live within a suburb. But how much do you know about your neighbor and about their culture? And are you tolerant to that culture?
It even goes to, you know, simple things in terms of how you communicate or you put your messaging across various communities. I know that you call me to a town hall meeting, chances are I'm not going to be there. But if there's a Zoom link, I'm going to be there. I'll be there on Zoom. Yet, in terms of the legislation, it's the standardization of things, in terms of how it needs to be done, and we've even legislated it.
And people are not always open to that, right? And, you know, one thing we've always overlooked, and this is something you can highlight in your white paper, is that in the apartheid government, right, it was a top-down structure, right? The government told you what needed to be done, how it needed to be done. And then suddenly, overnight, you decide, no, listen, we are all friends, right? We're going to have bottom-up planning, right? But you knew that previously, if you raised your voice, you were taken to task. And now you're calling me to a public meeting, and you expect me to be open with you, right? And many people were not open to that idea because they said, regardless of what I told you before, I was always shut down, and you still did what you wanted me to do, right? So there was this lack of trust. And the lack of trust is still there in many regards, right? Because those that did go were the tenderpreneurs, right? And they are there now to look after their own interests, especially in the public participation meetings. So the bottom field is still not heard. It's still not heard, and those are the people that really require the assistance. So how are you going to go and engage with them? I'm not too sure. As I said, I did try to engage with them, but you know, there's such intimidation on the bottom that you and I, sitting in our suburban homes, cannot understand. Right? You need somebody at the bottom that can actually understand. And I tried to engage, right? But it came to a point where the lady actually told me, you know what, the last time someone spoke, they put his shack on fire. So she's, you know, and she told me this, and she said, okay, you know, like, I can't say anything more. And I gave her my WhatsApp number, and I said, you know, if you feel like talking, here's my WhatsApp number, and then, you know, only once we know can we bring about changes. And to date, I have not heard back from her. So how then do you go and engage with those that require the assistance?
Maybe because it seems to be very complex, and I haven't lost hope. If it's complicated, you've referenced communities. It gets even more complicated where you think about these the district municipalities, because there's a participation process that happens there, local municipalities, and then there are metros there. In us talking about decentralization, maybe offer your own critique of how is it playing out, and how can it work better?
I don't know. I strongly oppose the DDM model because instead of us going smaller, we're going bigger, right? And bigger doesn't solve the problems.
So if you say smaller, or how would it work? How do you change the current system?
My current proposal on the table is we've given us 25 years to integrate. Everybody that wanted to move has moved, right? If I wanted to go live in an Indian area, I went in and lived in an area. If I wanted to live in a white area, I lived in a white area. So if you look at your suburbs currently, as they are, I would say they're pretty much integrated, right? So what stops us now to say, okay, now we're going to go and defragment? Because previously you didn't want to defragment urban areas and rural areas because of the racial profiles, right? And you had a basis for that. But now, 25 years later, each one is integrated racially. So if I was to demarcate two suburbs together, you can't tell me that it's done on racial profile any longer, Right?
But where do you put the argument around the economies of scale, and the fact that it's sometimes planning? Yeah, so you do these demarcations based on go back to the functionality, catchment areas, and those type of things.
But that's exactly where the problem comes in, is because in 25 years, we have not managed to create an economic base for any of those suburbs, right? So we cannot go back and say we're going to break it up unless you break it up on a different scale to say, we're breaking it out on cohesiveness, right? Instead of economic viability or economics of scale. And then on basis of cohesiveness, you said, okay, this area here does not have an employment area, right? And you giving only them the budget. And the community is going to be small enough to hold the municipality to account. To say that, in the beginning of the year, you had an IDP for this area, which is 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. And you promised us that the community center is going to be up and running. Why is it not up and running? Right? Because now it's all eyes on you.
Do you think it will be more effective than the current system? And I'm thinking about we've been bemoaning inefficiencies, corruption, and will it not multiply that?
About context as well.
Yeah.
There is this new idea that is really developing, particularly in the global north, which is quite an interesting idea, but contextually, obviously, it suits the kind of system that they had developed, particularly taking into account that the global north, Western countries, financially and fiscal otherwise, they are quite stronger than your global south. But there's this concept of community governance, or should I say neighborhood governance. But, if I think of it from a community perspective in South Africa, which is an African country, call community organizing back in the days. And we are very strong in South Africa. As we're about to conclude, this conversation, it's good for us to also take a little bit of some examples that used to be there, that existed. I mean, there were communal, organized systems of rural economies. And rural communities were really self-sustainable, during your colonial times, until obviously the land question came into play after 1913, when most rural communities lost their land as a base for their economy and their livestock. But this community-orientated type of governance, do you think it does have, a significant role to play as we are talking about decentralization, whether to go big or go small? I don't know what you would think about such.
And how do you match it with the political governance that is enshrined in all our laws?
So the question of the global local debate comes in, right? Like do you form part of the global village, or do you start creating an image for yourself, right? And I think at one stage everybody was all for being globalized, but as you look at time, how time passes, everybody's going back to the roots in some way, right? And tourism is looking for something different these days. And maybe that's exactly where our niche can be, because we haven't yet, developed on such a scale. And maybe we can just go back to our cultural roots to say, it comes back to your question of what standard are we holding ourselves up to? Like, can we not let people live how they would like to live? And that on its own, creates some sort of hub for them to say that, this is where the Xhosa people live, and then tourists come in, and then you can actually experience that culture. And that economy doesn't have to be buildings. Economy can be culture as well, right? It can be people, it can be experiences, and those are things we haven't explored previously, right? And what I've realized also is, even the Indian community, the South African Indian community has their own culture. And if you go into those communities, I don't know if any of you all have been there, but I grew up there. Like, we go around a mosque. Like 5 times a day, you go to mosque, right? And that's a culture on its own. And if people can experience that culture, it can also, develop it from the bottom up, instead of forcing this top-down UN model to say, this is how things need to be. It worked during apartheid. I mean, yes, maybe it was too stringently applied, but it worked. You know, those communities were vibrant, and people were happy. Right? So why is it that we wanted to change it so drastically?
So in urban planning, what the planners are discussing right now, they're talking about how it started a long time ago, but the one person that puts it very well is the late Professor Vanessa Watson, when she was talking about when she's talking about how planning as a profession has not transformed to adapt to local conditions. So if the standard is that a house will be built of brick and mortar and this is the minimum for it, that's what it is. It doesn't take into consideration the context. If the standard in terms of the Red Book says you'll need to have a park, a school, and meanwhile within the certain distances, meanwhile in certain communities we know that those things maybe are not as much needed because of the context. We haven't really and culture, we haven't really adapted to that. So we still have a very long way to go.
So one of the issues that I'm currently experiencing in terms of bylaws is the African community and the Indian community have this culture of sacrifice, right? Whether it's someone is born or someone has died or I've moved into a new house, you want to bring the animal to the property and slaughter it, right? Bylaws doesn't allow that because they call it cruelty to animals, right? And that's the aspect that we need to bring about a change to say, but culturally, how can you ask me to overlook my own culture, right? Because of your culture, because you haven't done it and you haven't experienced it.
Even back to your point, to even say, oh no, but we allow it, you just need to apply with the SPCA. When? How much will it take for me to go to the SPCA offices? Because I don't have fiber, I don't have data. The cost associated with me being of a particular cultural or social association to fit into this mold.
But the other way is the SPCA will tell you exactly how it needs to be slaughtered. But your ancestors have shown you over many years on how you need to implement the tradition, right? So now, are you going to go against your traditions to fit into the model to live in the urban area, right? Right? And that's on a lighter note to say that this is the issues that we're having with our bylaws in integration of racial areas to create one area, because on whose standards are we then living? That's the question. Is
bylaws is actually one of the episodes that we are planning to have at a later stage, and Nosipo is a what do you call this? An advocate for city governance. I'm an advocate for rural governance. So when you talk about bylaws, we are really going to push ourselves a little bit deeper, because coming back to our topic of decentralization, fiscal abilities for municipalities to raise revenue, bylaws are the ways in which you can do that. You can fine non-abiding citizens to your municipal bylaws, but those bylaws don't take into consideration that there are certain jurisdictional geographies where the characteristic of a so-called municipal town or a municipal village may not fit quite neatly into those bylaws, like cattle's moving in between small towns. There are communities who have to take their cattle grazing from one village to the other, and the shorter route might be through a town.
There are roads.
Absolutely. So these types of debates are very, very important.
Yes, and this brings you back to the question of localization, right? Like why are we not going localized? Why are we? Well, even now, currently, the NDP. And there's many laws in between that tell you exactly how your cities need to be structured and how they need to be done. But locally, people have a way of living. They are living, right?
Exactly.
Why can you not be accepting of how they're living and then just adapt a little bit to make sure that it's viable?
Clearly, there are no straight answers to this, and unfortunately, we need to find a way of experiment within boundaries. I'm interested to hear from you, because we don't want to leave this episode and saying, oh, okay, it's not working. You're so what? What do you think should happen?
I'm all for a pilot study for now. We never did a pilot study before we implemented the Demarcation Act. We just went all out, right? And I think we need to find a specific area. It doesn't need to be urban. It doesn't need to be a metropolitan. We can find a local municipality and say, you know what, let's go and just figure out what is going on here. And then we adjust bylaws accordingly and see whether it's going to work. And then be flexible enough to change, right? Without political changes, if that brings change. Because what I find is every time a new political party comes in, then there's new standards that need to be abided by, and there's new aims and objectives. But in this case, we keep it technical, right? Go in there's a reason why you have technical individuals. You go in and you experiment it, and if it works, then you move it on to the next one. And you do a stepwise development instead of just an overall holistic development. And this is something I've told the MDB as well. I said, guys, unfortunately, we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to accept that if it hasn't worked in 25 years, it's not going to work in 50 years. Right? Something we did was wrong, and we need to accept it so that future generations can improve. Otherwise, we're going to constantly have dysfunctional municipalities. AG is going to say dysfunctionality, and that's where it stops, right? And, over the years, we've seen municipalities going from probably 5% to now 89% dysfunctionality, and we're not doing anything about it. It's just like, oh yes, we're dysfunctional kind of a thing, right? But what is the crux of it? And my solution to this is our municipalities are too big. They are simply just too big. We have too much of underdeveloped land. We have too many communities within them that are not gelling as such, and this is creating conflict. And we need to go back and understand what is it that we're actually working with. Right, because I'm sitting with you, but how much do I know about your culture? Right? And that's maybe where we need to go into the university basis to say, we're teaching theory, but is it suitable to the South African context? Because nobody has ever taught me how a Xhosa wedding takes place, or what ceremonies take place when a Muslim child is married. So how am I supposed to be accepting of the next person? Right, so we need to start right from the bottom. In terms of integration, it starts from cultural integration, not just spatial integration. Yes.
All right. Definitely, that's all that we have for today.
Definitely, that's great topic.
This topic is a very broad topic, and that's why we always say that local government is not as simplistic as we think it is. It is very complex. It's a very complex sphere, and we need to unpack it and take it a bit at a time. Bite this huge animal. Local government a bit of, in small little bits, so that at least we also make sure that our audience get to understand these complexities and also give them background knowledge of where we really do come from. So thank you so much for joining us today and framing our discussion around decentralization and the way in which local government had been structured from local, district and metropolitan areas. But we do hope that we will have you for our next episode that might follow in the future, because I'd really like us to drill down into what we call spatial justice.
And social inclusion.
Exactly. Well, folks at home, thank you so much for giving us your 1 hour of your time within this week to listen to our podcast. Please make sure that you click on the link at the bottom to subscribe. It would be lovely for us to have more viewers. And thank you so much to EPF, which is our main founding sponsor. Until we meet again, cheers. Hey, tada.